Hi, I'm Max Bergman.
And I'm Donatien Rui.
And this is The Eurofile, a podcast where we look at Europe through a Washington lens. Welcome to another episode of The Eurofile. Today we will discuss the fallout from last week's Liberation Day. On Wednesday last week, President Trump announced a sweeping new set of tariffs, arguing that they would allow the United States to flourish economically. We are recording right now at 9:30 a.m. Monday morning on April 7th. The stock market is about to open here in the U.S. There's already been carnage around the world. And so this is going to be the topic for our show today. And we have a special guest. He's a recurring guest. He's been on the show numerous times. He's Federico Steinberg. Federico is the Prince Astorius Chair at Georgetown University, where he is a professor. And he is also a non-resident resident fellow here with our program at CSIS. When I say non-resident resident, Federico is here all the time, and we really appreciate having him. He's been here for the last few years and will be here for a few more years. So Federico, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
So I think let's just start by unpacking what is happening right now in the world economy. Markets are tanking everywhere in Asia, in Europe, here in the United States. Federico, maybe offer some of your thoughts, and then I think maybe we'll pivot and talk about what Europe is going to do in response to this.
So basically, the global economy was doing reasonably okay at the beginning of the Trump administration, with growth projections around 3%. The US economy is slowing down, but still growing. The European economy is also with weak growth, particularly Germany, but with some better prospects, given that there's going to be a substantive increase in investment for security and defense, and also for other issues, and a change in the debt brake in Germany, fiscal rules in Europe. And this basically came as a huge shock. It started with the first announcements of the tariffs to Mexico and Canada and China. Everybody agrees that the problem here is uncertainty. So the situation in which you don't know if tariffs are going to be imposed or not, or negotiated, is generating a lot of uncertainty. Big sell-off in the markets with a fall of almost 10% in the last week. And today's markets are crashing in Asia. And the Europeans are receiving a 20% tariff. This reads as a 10% baseline tariff, just like everybody else. Like, for example, the UK is getting a 10% tariff. And this seemed to be non-negotiable. This is what Trump wants to have permanently, but we'll see. And then in addition to that, based on this formula that the administration designed, which takes into account goods but not services, they decided that the European Union is going to get an additional 10%. So we're looking at 20% tariffs. This is something that is going to slow down global economic growth, but it's less than Asian countries.
Maybe let's talk about that for a second. On the one hand, I think the Europeans were expecting this to happen. The mood, music, and transatlantic relations has been incredibly poor. The EU had been attacked by Donald Trump numerous times, and it seemed pretty clear there were going to be tariffs against the EU. I think what was sort of stunning was that the tariffs that were done against especially our Asian democratic allies, who I don't think really saw this coming, and those tariffs were much higher than the EU. I mean, in some respects, the EU came out of this better than others. Do you think that will shape how the EU retaliates? Is the EU going to try to work with others to retaliate? Is it not? How do you perceive of where Europe is in the food chain here by the tariffs that came down on it?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. If we compare the EU tariffs to those, well, first of all, to China, which is 34 on top of the 20% already implemented in the last 2 months, on top of the average 20% coming from the Biden administration, we're looking at levels that are much higher. But then also countries like Vietnam or Bangladesh or really Cambodia, these countries have higher tariffs because they have a larger trade surplus in goods with the US, which seems to be the main thing that Trump cares about. Anyway, for the European Union, this is a huge shock. The 20% tariff is something very, very large. And even a 10% tariff, which is supposed to be the baseline for industrial products, is very high because the average tariff there is around 1.5%, very low. It's almost, virtually free trading goods in the transatlantic space. Now, what you said is very important. So what is going to be the reaction? The European Union, I was looking at some macro estimates, calculates that basically, given that 2.1% of the European Union's GDP depends on export to the US, which is, much, much worse than Mexico or Canada. The effect is important, but it's not so severe. It's 0.4% of GDP less growth for the whole of the EU if these tariffs remain and there's no retaliation. And if we only look at countries with less exposure, like France and Spain, it's 0.2% of growth compared to the baseline. So these are numbers that are manageable. Now, the question is, what is the reaction? If the EU goes slowly trying to negotiate, or if it uses its full arsenal of instruments, including the anti-coercion instrument, the European response depends on what the Europeans want to do in terms of the balance between an economic response and a geopolitical response. So basically, the economics would encourage you not to do much, because if the EU responds with higher tariffs, then there's going to be more inflation in Europe, and this is going to potentially escalate. But on the other hand, the attitude of Trump suggests that the EU has to show that it's large enough to put some big response on the table, just like China did. This morning, I was reading that Ursula von der Leyen also proposed already a free trade zone on industrial products, a zero tariff area, which is not a big change compared to what we have now, but it's a symptom a symbol that the EU basically would like to negotiate. But the Council is going to be discussing in the next few days the response first to the steel and aluminum tariffs that were established the previous month, and in the next days to the big reciprocal tariffs.
So earlier you talked about the different levels of tariffs that are being imposed, the 10%, 20% on top of some permanent tariffs that Trump has imposed, if I understand correctly. What's the history of permanent tariffs? I'm asking this more to say, how common are they? Is this something that we've only seen a few times? Is it something that some countries of the world have used for a long time? Just so we can understand the difference between those permanent tariffs and something that is meant to change behavior in the short and medium term.
Well, these tariffs are huge in the transatlantic economic space. So developing countries traditionally have higher tariffs, but the European Union and the US and Canada and Japan and the advanced countries since the 1950s, first with the GATT rounds of negotiations, then within the WTO framework, were able to cut tariffs substantially, and there are no tariffs on the services sector, which is the most dynamic. There are non-tariff barriers, but that's another chapter of the conversation. So here we're looking at the biggest increase since the smooth Hawley tariffs of the 1930s, which historically are regarded as something that was very negative to the global economy and made the Great Depression even worse. So if they are made permanent, even a 10% rate would be a substantial change. It would become something in which the US is much more isolated, and it will clearly reconfigure the different value chains and trade relationships across the world. And here, the European Union has been very clear. It wants to diversify out of the US market, getting closer with new free trade agreements, with ratifying the Mercosur-EU agreement, having an agreement with India, with Indonesia, with others. It's a bit concerned about Chinese exports, the overcapacity of the Chinese industrial sector that is not going to be able to sell to the US as much as before. These products being dumped into the European market, so that's going to be sensitive. But basically, what we don't know yet is what's going to be the final response to the Trump tariffs and the ongoing negotiations.
Maybe we could talk a little bit about the anti-coercion instrument and how the EU can respond, or whether it should respond. Part of me thinks that given there's going to be a massive collision between the US and Europe over tech regulations and tech policy, that in some ways doing what the EU is going to do, which is implement EU law, that it might make sense to just do that right now and make it part of the response, because you're going to do that anyway. And so why have a long drawn out negotiation over tariffs? And then suddenly, if there is a prospect of negotiations, which I don't think is quite clear, but why do something on tariffs, then have that resolved? Then suddenly there's either a commission decision or a legal ruling about tech regulations in which, it hits US companies. And that then leads to another major collision in transatlantic relations. So it strikes me to kind of combine those, to have that fight now, but that would require using the anti-coercion instrument, which is this vehicle that the EU set up. I guess the idea was initiated in the first Trump administration. Chinese action against Lithuania then brought it into actual form. But now it strikes me as this is the time to use it. What do you think the prospects are, Federico, that the anti-coercion instrument gets used? And then if it can be invoked, what does that mean? And how would Europe utilize it?
So I think that first of all, in Brussels and other European capitals, they're looking at the stock market because they think there's a possibility that if the stock prices continue falling, that they could be suspended and give some more time for the negotiations. But if that doesn't happen, we have like two camps of different views in Europe. Countries like Italy and Spain have said that it's better to wait, not to use this bazooka of the anti-coercion instrument, whereas other countries have shown, their intent to, if there's no agreement like this zero tariffs on industrial products across the Atlantic, which, by the way, is something that Elon Musk suggested, and that was part of the idea of the TTIP, Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, that collapsed 10 years ago, and that some other people in Europe are calling for, like Enrico Letta. But if this doesn't happen, to respond very strongly. So the anti-coercion instrument, as you said, is an instrument that allows the European Union to respond whenever it is coerced by someone. And you could clearly interpret this as coercion. Basically, either you do what I want or I take some measures. This is basically the logic of this negotiating element of the reciprocal tariffs. And then this authorizes the European Commission to propose to the European Council measures in response to that country that could be WTO incompatible. This is important because the Europeans want to be playing by the rules, even though the WTO is not functioning very effectively these days. And then this could include not only tariffs, but non-tariff barriers, taxation, any other measure. And it's clear that given that the European Union has a surplus in goods, but a big deficit in services with the United States. By the way, if the EU were to apply the same formula that the Trump administration is applying to trade in services, it would have to impose a tariff on the US products because the US has a surplus in services. We're talking here about high value added services, telecommunications, financial services, legal services, consulting, etc., etc. So basically, this is where the big tech companies operate. They make huge profits in the European market. Keep in mind that the Chinese market is not very open for many of these companies, Amazon, X, etc. But the European market is 450 million. The anti-coercion instrument has to be authorized, as I said, by the Council with a large majority, but not unanimity, which is flexible enough. And it would, for example, authorize higher taxes or even blocking part of the operation of these companies in Europe. And this can also be combined with the regulation on services that the European Union established last year, which could, be used saying, there's this element of misinformation from some of these platforms in the European Union. So the options are huge. I think that the Europeans still would prefer to negotiate and not to use it, but I think they're ready. One thing that's important to say is that this whole process of the anti-coercion instrument takes around 6 weeks if you do it fast enough. So timing traditional slow movement of the European Union.
Yeah, there's a meeting of EU trade ministers today in Luxembourg. Finbar Birmingham, who's a reporter, was sort of documenting where everyone kind of stood on retaliation. And I think what you sort of see is that it looks like if Germany's on board, then you would have, I think, perhaps a qualified majority in favor of invoking it. Now, once you've, I guess, voted to invoke the anti-coercion instrument, it doesn't specify what you actually do. So that would then be figured out later, right? Am I getting the mechanics of that right?
No, you have to go to the council with the proposals that you are putting on the table. For example, for the steel and aluminium tariffs response, the Commission doesn't have to ask the member states. Even to respond to this 10% tariff, it doesn't have to ask. But if you want to use the anti-coercion, then you have to say, I'm going to do A, B, and C, and go with that to the council. But given the political balance in Europe and the perception of the threat from the US, because I think this is really something radically different from before, I don't think that there will be any problem to pass this with qualified majority.
Is it your sense that the countries hardest hit in Europe, which from what we're seeing and what we know is, Germany, Slovakia, Austria, Ireland, Italy, obviously is a lot of machinery, things like that. I feel like we could argue it either way. Would they be more open to using the anti-coercion instrument because they are harder hit? Or are they more on the side of let's not be too hasty here because we are taking the brunt of this pain?
Well, I think if you are willing to use the anti-coercion instrument is because you've understood that you're going to take some economic pain. It's a little bit like Mark Carney in Canada, knowing that, you're going to be strong, even though you know that the trade relationship is very, very deep, because you understand it's the only way to show the Trump administration that you have tools, you have your bazooka, as they say in Brussels, And then you have to combine that with more spending at the European level. And this is important. And also, ideally, with some decision by the European Central Bank to reduce interest rates. And this can be done if inflation doesn't accelerate, of course. So you depreciate a little bit the euro, because the other thing that is being very, very surprising is that after the Trump administration announced the tariffs, instead of an appreciation of the dollar, which is what you would expect, because, there's going to be a little bit more inflation, so the Fed would have to raise interest rates, so the dollar appreciates. The uncertainty and the collapse in the stock market is signaling higher probability of recession, and therefore you have capital outflows, and markets are anticipating that the Fed might even have to cut rates, despite the fact that inflation will go up because of the slowdown of the economy and the increase in unemployment. So the dollar is becoming weaker, which is making American goods more competitive. So, this is a little bit complex because we don't know what part of these forces are playing out. The other variable that I think is interesting to watch is the price of oil, which collapsed dramatically last week. And remember that the European Union is an oil importer. It has very, very limited production of fossil fuels. It's not like the US. So this also plays well to the European Union economic dynamics because it's cheaper to import the oil you need for industrial products.
So for Europe right now, the trade exposure does not seem as significant as many other countries. It seems like Europe could weather the storm and is now kind of watching the financial fallout that comes from this. Are there steps that you think the Europeans should be taking to kind of rebalance their kind of global position? Is it engaging in more free trade efforts, perhaps with countries in Asia? Cecilia Malmström, the former EU trade commissioner, argued for the EU to join CPTPP, the Indo-Pacific Trade Agreement. Do you see actions like that? Are there steps that the Europeans could take to make the euro more of a safe asset? Is it time to sort of move in that direction? In the fallout here, what do you see the steps that Europe should be taking to kind of position itself for what could be potentially a new economic order?
Just two-finger question on top of that. It's also insulate itself from potential fallout of the massive escalation between the US and China. Just those two, which I'm assuming also has an impact in Europe.
So absolutely, Europe is not as exposed as China or as Canada and Mexico, especially to the US economy. And there are three things the Europeans are doing, but maybe they should do more of those and faster. One is to take the barriers out of the single market. Mario Draghi was very clear that you have internal barriers, particularly non-tariffs for the integration of the single market that would unleash productivity growth and economic growth. The second, of course, is diversification out of US markets. And here we all know the EU is engaged in a number of negotiations of free trade agreements, ratification with Mercosur, new FTA with India, Indonesia, other regions, not with China. And with China, they are a little bit concerned about Chinese exports that don't go to the US ending up in the European market, particularly of electric vehicles, industrial products, etc. But then there's one opportunity for the euro, but we're not there yet, which is that all these trade wars, doubts about the independence of the Federal Reserve, where the US economy is going, might trigger, and this could happen fast if the situation continues. It doesn't have to happen, but it could happen fast if it really happens. Some diversification away from the dollar and a reduction in the role of the dollar as a reserve currency. In that scenario, the EU should be willing to issue large amounts of European debt, the Eurobonds, because there's going to be a lot of money on the central bank of Brazil or of Saudi Arabia or of China trying to diversify out of the US dollar assets into other assets. There's not enough supply of euro-denominated bonds. So that would be an opportunity. That would be a way to finance defense spending, energy transition, other European public goods. And this would dramatically reshape the international economic order, both on the trade side, as we've discussed, but also on the financial side. This is not yet with us, but we have to observe cautiously how the stock market evolves and also the behavior of the US administration, because the only way for the dollar to lose its hegemonic status is by a number of decisions by the administration that really undermine the confidence in the dollar.
Federico, fascinating conversation. We're going to be watching the markets and the economy this week and going forward, and we may have you back to discuss things however this evolves. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
That's it for today's episode. As always, if you enjoyed the show, please subscribe and leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts. You may also be interested in our sister podcast, Russian Roulette, which covers the latest on Vladimir Putin's Russia and the ongoing war in Ukraine. Our thanks to our producers Shannon Young, Otto Svensson, and Lexi Linnefelter for coordinating and researching this episode. We'll be back soon with another assessment of Europe through a Washington lens. Until next time.